As we get closer and closer to the 2026 NFL Draft, we're starting to see things materialize and crystallize for what the Giants might do in round one. And Caleb Downs continues to be a talking point and a potential pick. We got to react to what Albert Breer and Todd McShay had to say. But if you are ready for the NFL Draft and you want even more NFL Draft content, we've got a company-wide live 3-round mock draft coming up next week. If you're ready for it, you want more draft stuff, hit that thumbs up icon. This is New York Giants Now by Chat Sports, and I am your host, Marshall Green. Appreciate everybody for clicking on today's show as we react to Albert Breer and Todd McShay connecting all of the dots between John Harbaugh, his coaching disciples, and the moves that he and those coaches have made when it comes to drafting a safety and becoming a face of the organization. Albert Breer saying this, quote, "Downs is interesting to me, though, because I'm looking at John Harbaugh's history. And when he and Wink Martindale re-imaged the Ravens' defensive backfield in 2018, one of the biggest pieces of it was we want to play defense like other teams play offense. In other words, we want to dictate terms to the offense. That way, to do that for them, we want to be as flexible as possible right up to the snap. The biggest piece of that for John Harbaugh was having a heady safety, was having Eric Weddle there. Then they go from Weddle, and that ends up falling on Kyle Hamilton. And then you see some of the guys that came out of there. Mike McDonald winds up in Seattle, and they draft Nick Emmanwori to be that guy. You look at Jesse Mentor and how much they put on Derwin James to be that guy in LA. That defense has become one of the premier schemes in the league. And you see other teams trying to replicate it, and obviously John brings Dennard Wilson in with him to run it. I just think of the football IQ of Derwin James and Kyle Hamilton and Eric Weddle and Nick Emmanwori. And then Albert Breer asks Todd McShay, what's Caleb Downs' number one trait? And Todd McShay responds, truly one of the smartest players I've ever evaluated. This goes back to when John Harbaugh was on the Mike Francesa show, and he talked about, Mike, would you take a safety at 5? Would you take Caleb Downs, the Buckeyes? Like, look, well, I'm in favor of drafting Hall of Fame players, and if Caleb Downs is a Hall of Fame player at safety, we'd love to have him. Quote, unquote, big fan. Big fan. That is what John Harbaugh has said, and you look at what all the coaches that worked under John Harbaugh, and they go on to other places. What do they do, or what do they try to do? They try to get an identity on defense. They try to get a game-changing safety, or they put a lot on the plate of a game-changing safety. Even before John Harbaugh had Kyle Hamilton, he did it with Ed Reed. He coached Brian Dawkins in Philly as well as a DB coach. Jesse Mentor goes to LA, and Derwin James, who's always a great player, seemingly becomes maybe the best safety in the National Football League. Mike McDonald leaves and becomes the coach at Seattle. Round 2, they take Nick Emmanwori, and he was ultimately a difference maker alongside Devon Witherspoon for them in the way that they were able to play defense and not be forced out of playing nickel. They played nickel, and they were allowed to play nickel because of Nick Emmanwori with 3 safeties and 2 safeties on the field. Same with Derwin James, the same with Kyle Hamilton. The only small difference is none of those players were really selected at number 5. But you think if John Harbaugh knew what he knew about Kyle Hamilton, he would be opposed of taking him at number 5? I don't think it would be a dumb idea to go back and look at 2018 and say, shoot, maybe Derwin James was a top 5 player in that class. And Nick Emmanwori, in a redraft, he ain't lasting till 35. And when you look back at this, hindsight's 2020, it's like, was he the 14th best player in the class? Was he the 17th best player in the class? Was he the 35th best player in the class? Or did we let the position safety have them fall down the board instead of defensive playmaker, defensive identity, and defensive, different functionality and ways that you can play defense? Let's start with Kyle Hamilton here. I know he's 6'4", 220 pounds, but let's not forget what happened at the NFL Combine and the Pro Days where he didn't look all that explosive, and that kind of helped him fall down the board on top of being a safety. Like we talked about that. He got 105 tackles this past year, 107 tackles the year before that, 81 tackles the year before that, 62 before that. tackles for loss every single year, making plays on balls in the air. He breaks up passes. He picks passes off. He forces fumbles. He has a knack for the football. And we saw immediately the impact he made when he was drafted by Baltimore. In 2021, the Baltimore Ravens were not a great defense. They definitely didn't force turnovers. They forced the 29th most turnovers. They had the 8th worst yards allowed. They were the 14th most points allowed. They allowed the most passing yards in the National Football League. They didn't have a good run defense, the best run defense. But they couldn't stop anyone from moving the ball through the air. That's why they went 8-9, and that is why they missed the playoffs. 1 year later, you plug in Kyle Hamilton, and they become one of the best defenses in the National Football League. They go 10-7, and they make the playoffs. Turnovers forced jumps up 19 spots. Yards allowed jumps up 14 spots. Points allowed jumps up 11 spots. You're the 3rd best points per game defense in the NFL. Passing yards, still not great, but you were a much better team at taking the football away, and you were a much more opportunistic football team as well. And we saw in 2023 and in 2024, the Ravens defense only got better and better. Derwin James, he was always a good player for the Los Angeles Chargers. But when they brought in a John Harbaugh disciple, a Jim Harbaugh disciple, who had a plan and a vision and a defined role for Derwin James at safety, it took his play and his playmaking ability and overall success of the defense to the next level. We know Derwin's great, and it's different. I hate that I'm even saying that. Like, should we overreact to Derwin James being 6'2" and being strong, fast, and all that with Kyle Hamilton when Caleb Downs is like a plus safety in height and weight as well? You look at the stats. The year prior to Jesse Minter being hired by LA to be their defensive coordinator, yes, they already did have Derwin James, but it could be argued that maybe he wasn't being put in the right spot. Maybe they weren't running the right scheme. Maybe they didn't have the guys and the coaches in place. And you can see on screen, they were not a very good team and they were not a very good defense. Then Jesse Minter comes. And look, Minter deserves a lot of credit for what turned around. But like John Harbaugh always says, the players are the most important thing. And Jesse Minter got hooked up with a safety in Derwin James, who he had a role for, he had a plan for, he had a vision for. And he was the identity of that defense. And they became one of the best defenses in the National Football League, allowing the least most points in the entire season. Then we saw Mike Macdonald, a John Harbaugh, Jim Harbaugh disciple, select Nick Emmanwori. Demon Wari, as the kids are calling him, still the coolest nickname out there. An athletic freak who changed the way that the Seattle Seahawks played defense. They can line him up on the line of scrimmage. He could be that big nickel for them. He could play inside the box as an off-ball linebacker. He could be that single high safety. He can play cover 2 and split the field, or cover 4 and split the field. And he became a weapon for that defense. And look, the Seattle defense wasn't terrible in the year prior to Emmanwori. Like, Macdonald is a defensive savant, arguably the best in the National Football League. But insert Emmanwori, you have another year of Macdonald implementing his scheme, and they go from a team that missed the playoffs and were a middle-of-the-pack defense to being arguably a top 5 defense and a team that kind of steamrolled the entire competition in the entire league in the playoffs. Ask Drake May what it's like to play defense against a team where you have Devon Witherspoon lining up in different places every single spot. Ask him what it's like when Nick Emmanwori is lining up in a different spot every single game. Those type of players are chess pieces. You talk about those safeties. Caleb Downs is right there with them. Is he as tall as them? No. Is he as strong as them? Maybe. Is he as fast on the 40 as them? No. But he's arguably smarter than all of them, and he's someone that did things that they didn't do. Like year one as an 18-year-old, started Alabama for Nick Saban, put up 100 tackles, then move on to Ohio State and become a national champion. Caleb Downs is cut from the exact same cloth from all three of those guys and might even be better than some of them. I thought this was really cool what Albert Breer said as well. He said, look, he's not as big as those guys. Look, Derwin James, Kyle Hamilton are build a players type of build. That's sort of the issue with Downs. How often does a player at his positions with his dimensions go that high? So I think for some teams, it's going to scare them off. He doesn't have a 40-yard dash on file, but like he says, you suspect he's not 4'4". He's not 6'3", the way Kyle Hamilton and Derwin James are. He's a great player, but if you're going to make an exception and take a safety where you normally don't take one, can we take him that high? I think that you can. I think you can take Caleb Downs at 5, and I think there's a world you could trade down to 8 and still get Caleb Downs and add another top 100 pick. I have never looked at a safety and like, shoot, man, he's only 6 foot, 206 pounds. Ed Reed was 5'11". Troy Polamalu was 5'10". Bob Sanders was 5'8". Earl Thomas was 5'10". Like, I've never looked at one of those guys like, it was like, man, if he was just 2 inches taller, he'd be a way better player. No, because Caleb Downs wins with what's between his ears. He wins with his anticipation. We always talk about an anticipatory thrower in the National Football League as a quarterback. He plays with anticipation as a defensive back that you just do not see. He sees plays unfolding before they happen. Like, you want to talk about getting a head coach and a defensive coordinator that are aligned to Dennard Wilson and John Harbaugh, and you want to get them a piece that they have a plan for, a proven plan for, and a track record of having that player be a facelift for the defense? It's hard to argue that Caleb Downs wouldn't be the best pick for the New York Giants, as a lot of people do believe he is the best football player in the draft. But you can't take him at 5 because he's not 6'2" instead of 6 foot, and he's 206 pounds instead of 216 pounds, and he has safety on his NFL.com player bio. I don't know. Caleb Downs is pretty damn good, and I like to have him on this football team. We've seen what other safeties do with Harbaugh disciples. I like that. I like that for this football team. Appreciate everybody for clicking on today's show. If you haven't yet, hit that thumbs up icon. Make sure you are following me on social media.